And my problem is the masculinity that seems to be perpetrated by Trump is that of masculinity that has inherently been dangerous to people over history.
I would argue it's a necessary danger, but it's not necessary in the sense that we need to harm minorities.
When Donald Trump launched his 2016 presidential campaign nearly a decade ago, Gen Z men were boys between the ages of 9 and 16. The Trump years have defined views of masculinity and leadership for many of these men who are now adults. How has this impacted them, and are they leaning into the strongman persona or pushing back? We asked them on Politics IRL.
I'm Alex Haggerty, lifelong Republican and Massachusetts Republican State Committee man of the Norfolk and Plymouth District.
My name is Chukwemeka BJ Oswagu. I run a nonprofit in Waltham, and I am an independent.
I'm Troy Ficillo, member of the Marlborough City Council and a registered Democrat.
I'm Nico Cady. I'm currently the president of the Babson College Republicans. I'm a current business student, and I'm a moderate Republican.
So thank you guys all for having me on your men's panel. I really appreciate that. I want to start out by noting that between 2020 and 2024, exit polling showed us that support for Trump among young men between 18 and 29 significantly increased. So what about Trump is making these young men identify with him? Why are young men identifying with Trump? Nico, we'll start with you.
I think primarily young men over 2020 to 2024, they really started listening to podcasts, taking away from more news-esque, I'd say, sources. And I think that has a lot to do, more to do with their personal lives and politics, because there was a lot that happened with COVID in young men. They may have lost themselves or have looked for a role model that I would argue isn't even Donald Trump and doesn't have anything to do with him. I think that whether it's Joe Rogan, Jocko Willink, Sean Ryan, David Goggins, whose book was very popular among people that I know in my generation, I think that their style of masculinity, their style of inward confidence is what men were looking for. And I think that Trump just tapped into that and made it a political weapon to wield, I would argue.
Well, I think you're completely correct. I think the Trump campaign you're correct on the podcast and the fact that they found them there. I think that the Trump campaign used the fact that masculinity was going to be a point of the campaign and went and found young men. I don't think it was just a coincidence. I think they purposefully went on these podcasts like Joe Rogan. They went on, had Kill Tony come over and do all that sort of stuff. I think that was a deliberate attempt to try to bring young men into the fold of MAGA, into the fold of the current Republican Party. So on that point, I totally agree. I think it was more, I do think Trump went out and found them, though. I don't think it was so much a natural, young men and boys, going online and trying to find something in themselves. I think it was Trump actually going out and identifying them and bringing them in.
Yeah, I think Trump definitely took advantage of a situation that had been brewing, like you said, over the course of years. I think young men, at least in the Democratic Party, have, in my experience, they've expressed feeling not wanted in the political beliefs that they have. So when you go out looking for something, you're going to find something. My problem isn't necessarily with the galvanization that Trump did of young men. My problem is in which the rhetoric that young men are not only becoming accustomed to, but are looking for, is inherently negative and violent against generally minorities and women. That's my issue. So
I think I kind of think a little differently. When we're talking about masculinity, I think what young men are geared toward is looking at someone who stands up for their beliefs, even when it's not popular or it's been tried to be silenced by people. I think, especially to Nico's point about the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, there was a lot that was lost from young men and young women too. I think it's also, looking at Trump, he embodies what I think most of us as Americans want to be. We want to be courageous or standing up for something that we believe in, whether you're left or on the right.
I want to be nothing like Trump.
Same here.
No, and I'm not saying...
None of you want to be like Trump. You all just agreed with that.
Absolutely not.
I don't know. Depends on what you're talking about and being like Trump.
Okay.
I don't I don't want to hijack.
I misspoke. I don't mean being like Trump, but seeing the strength that he projects, I think is something that young men are geared toward. And I think it was a genius strategy on Barron Trump for him to go on Joe Rogan and reach out to the younger generations like Trey, like you were talking about. But I think one of the things that really had young men go towards Donald Trump instead of Vice President Harris. I think we all saw that imagery of, when he got shot in the ear and he, as soon as, he got back up, raised his fist in the air and said, fight, fight, fight. I think not only is that just a masculine trait, but I think it's also something that embodies the American spirit, that of us, whatever your background, that the desires to keep going and standing up and fight for what you believe in.
Now, you just mentioned something super interesting, which is the idea of masculinity being silenced as well, something you touched on. Does anyone else think masculinity is being silenced?
No. I think, first and foremost, like, when we talk about masculinity, we have to talk about it in the context of this is a completely socially made up construct. We created what masculinity means, so we can make masculinity mean whatever we want it to mean. So to say masculinity is being silenced is just disingenuous, because masculinity can be whatever you want it to be. It's not about how strong you are, because there are women that are genuinely stronger than everybody at this table.
Yes.
It's not about, like, these certain things that we attribute specifically to masculinity have nothing to do with masculinity. And my problem is the masculinity that seems to be perpetrated by Trump is that of masculinity that has inherently been dangerous to people over history. That's the reality of it. And you can tell in the rhetoric that he uses, the way that he speaks about people, and the way that people rally behind the things that he says, regardless of how detrimental they can be to any given community of people.
Is Trump's masculinity dangerous?
I would argue it's a necessary danger, but it's not necessary in the sense that we need to harm minorities. I think it's a necessary danger, or it's a necessary danger that I think definitely in terms of foreign policy. From my perspective, I mean, America has been treating the world, and realistically, this does tie back, and I think that there's a part that I think Trump talks about, and it just thematically hints at, and that's the idea of self-sufficiency. And I think that does echo in his foreign policy.
When it comes to foreign policy, Trump is often kind of called a bully, a strongman, also, on foreign policy, and also in relation to kind of his detractors. Mm-hmm. Is this a quality of leadership that you think politics has been missing?
No.
No, I don't
No.
think so.
So I actually take a different approach to this question. So I think what we're seeing now, and why Donald Trump would be, some people in the media would call him a bully or a strong man, and it's something in my experience from serving locally on the Board of Health and on the Board of Selectmen and as a state committee member. The Democrat establishment and some in the mainstream media, national mainstream media, I should say, aren't used to Republicans who fight back. And I think that is part of the reason why Donald Trump is called everything under the sun. Obviously, there's some things he contributes himself to, but I think for the longest time, it's always been the issue, and voters, especially young voters, men voters, have always heard, oh, the Republican Party is acting weak. They don't stand up for themselves. They don't stand for their principles. Here comes Donald Trump with a wrecking ball and saying to the Democrat Party, no, this is where I stand on my issues. These are my foreign policies. This is what we're going to do with trade.
But he doesn't stand. He doesn't stand on those things. His tax plan came out last week. Where was no taxation on overtime or Social Security? Like, none of that stuff. He says things that people want to hear to take advantage of people, and that's not a leader that I think that we should be following. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to follow someone who blatantly will lie to people just to get support. And he's done it multiple times. And I'm not saying that every politician is clean of the fact of lying. They all do it. But the reality is the way that he's garnering this support through lies, intimidation, and negative rhetoric is dangerous. Regardless, whether we want to admit it at this table or not, it's dangerous to people who look like me. It's dangerous to people who look like you guys. It's just dangerous. It's dangerous for all involved, because at the end of the day, we've spent so much time together at this point. like more time than I spent with my parents over the past year. But we spent so much time together at this point. I think you guys are very like cool people, right? But the reality is, I don't think that you have those same negative or dangerous viewpoints to the extent that Donald Trump has. But you're going to have to face the crowd that he's drawing by saying the things that he does. And it's been proven to us over time, the election results in 2020, that Donald Trump is not going to speak up against the bad actors that he has following him. He's not going to do it. If anything, he's going to pardon them on his first day back in office.
I'd say to those people, bring it on then. Bring it on. Those people are not a majority.
No, go ahead. So from my experience as the first openly gay Republican elected to the Mass GOP State Committee, we always hear the rhetoric of, Donald Trump is anti-LGBTQ or different things. One of the things that I always use an example is, in 2019, the Trump administration in his first term launched a coalition to decriminalize homosexuality around the globe, and actually spoke at the UN in front of nations that jail and kill people like me, and just for simply existing. And Donald Trump was fighting for people like myself. I was hearing from different rhetoric that says all of a sudden, gay people are going to go into internment camps or in concentration camps. Well, then what's going to happen to Secretary Treasury Scott Bessent, the fifth in line to be President of the United States, an openly gay man who is now in charge of the Treasury Department? He's fifth in line to be President of the United States. And he was picked for the job, because based on merit, his economic background, not because he checked off a box that, Scott Bessent is gay. He was qualified for the position. And that's one of the things that I respect of President Trump, that he picks people based on merit. And will it get picked up in a story? Probably not.
I want to bring this back to something you guys were talking about before, actually, which was the manosphere and podcasts, and how Trump kind of leaned on that, and he was on, Joe Rogan and Theo Von and Andrew Schultz, a whole bunch of different podcasts. I'm wondering, do you guys listen to these podcasts, and how do you think they're impacting young men's views of masculinity? Trey?
Yeah, when I was probably in high school, I would purposely listen to things that were on the other side of the aisle. I've been a lifelong Democrat, and so, I'd listen to Ben Shapiro. I don't know if you consider that the manosphere, but I had a lot of friends who then got into Joe Rogan, and so I'd start to listen to that a little bit. And for me, it never really did anything for me because I knew where my politics stood, but I could have conversations with friends of mine who were listening to these podcasts or engaging in the social media regularly, and I have many friends who still do, and that was a big part of why a couple friends that come to mind right now, why they voted for Donald Trump, is they saw him on Joe Rogan and they just couldn't envision any other candidate doing that sort of thing. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I don't really agree with that. I could see a lot of politicians going on shows like that and having really articulate conversations. First thing I think of is Bernie Sanders with Theo Von. Like that was a really interesting conversation that was had. And
Bernie Sanders was on Joe Rogan.
Right, exactly. So I think it's really about, politicians putting themselves in positions to get in front of this audience. I think that's the biggest thing. I think Democrats need to do more to get in front of this audience and to share our message with people, because I think a lot of times, a lot of young men will find that, in fact, the Democratic Party is not only talking the talk, but walking the walk on a lot of the issues that they care about and that their families care about. So I'd like to see more Democrats get into that kind of, that space, into that internet community. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing. Like I said, my engagement with it is not a lot, but I think we have to be present there if we're going to, get to those people.
The reality is podcasts are not inherently bad things. They're not like, it's not like if you have a podcast, you're automatically evil. I think part of the issue that, should be addressed and needs to be addressed is these podcasts have huge followings, and we have to look at who they're platforming. And I think that's what the real issue isn't necessarily the fact that the podcast exists. It's that some of the people that are asked to be on these podcasts, and I think that that's something that needs to be addressed. Like, put political leanings aside. Like Joe Rogan, for example, has probably the biggest podcast in the world. His political leanings, you might as well throw a dart at a dartboard. Like, you don't really know. Right. But it's the people that, if you're inviting people to be on your podcast and this podcast gets 50 million views, you're going to be inviting information into the general line of public that might just be incorrect. None of it is ever fact-checked. It's just taken to be fact. And then people take these ideas and they run with them. And some of those ideas can be detrimental towards the general American ethos.
Democrats just failed to convey the message on what they were trying to do, and Republicans didn't. They didn't fail to convey the message on foreign policy. They didn't fail to convey the message, especially on Joe Rogan and other things. I think a massive aspect, I try to do the same thing, Trey, about watching, whether it's Pod Save America or, insert. I watched Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy. The major aspect of, this gets back to the whole campaign thing. I kind of want to bring it back to the manospheres. A major aspect I heard from a lot of my male friends is they didn't really think, they were open to voting for Kamala Harris. They didn't like Donald Trump, but it didn't even sound, and they had gone through 4 years of Joe Biden's articulation, or lack thereof, and there was this conception that she just could not articulate particularly well. And the fact, I'm not saying that
I think the Manosphere podcasts helped Trump articulate his message?
It was a confirmation bias. The lack of her presence there, it was enough.
Well, even if she was in those spaces, do you think they would have been receptive of her? I disagree wholeheartedly that they would have been receptive. I don't think that any people that have decided that they were voting for Trump were not going to be receptive of a black woman in those spaces. Whether she went or not, they might have given her props or credit, thank you for coming on, but they weren't going to change the minds that are already made up.
Would that have won her the election? We'll never know. Obviously, I disagree. I think that people are a hell of a lot more open to voting the other race than It's not an issue.
The race and gender.
Either or. I have not found that a problem. If people are, I know the most misogynistic Democrats in the world. That's my experience. But I think that you can't not do that. And that was a major talking point, that Kamala Harris couldn't string a sentence together. And she literally.
I don't know about that.
I so wholeheartedly disagree. You're talking about a heavily educated individual talking about they can't string a sentence together. That is the nature of the misinformation that we're talking about. The fact that is even a sentence that came out in this space is crazy.
Okay. And you just told us you watched the Call Her Daddy episode. I thought she was extremely articulate on a non-traditional media forum, Howard Stern show. I thought Howard Stern wanted to keep her there. He kept peppering her with questions because she had articulate answers, and Howard Stern knew he couldn't bring Trump on because he wouldn't get that.
She is a qualified individual. She was a district attorney. She was Attorney General, U.S. Senator, Vice President. I disagree with her policies because they flip-flopped from 2020 to even 2022 to 2024. No, and I think for her, it was a huge missed opportunity when she refused to go. Well, she originally said she was going to go on Joe Rogan, and then she backed out of it. I think if you're running...
There were some scheduling issues, I believe, with the Joe Rogan situation. Yep. But I'm sorry, I don't want to ruin your point here, but I want to keep with you, Alex, because... There's this interesting kind of dynamic playing out right now where millennial men like yourself have kind of grown up in a lot of ways with Obama. He was in office for 8 years, as you were probably in some formative years of your lives. Whereas with Gen Z men, you're growing up in a lot of ways with Trump during some of the most formative years of your lives. What's the difference? And Alex, maybe you can answer, and Nico, since you're our youngest on the panel, I'd like to hear from both of you and the difference between growing up with Obama and growing up with Trump.
I love local politics, and I'm sure Trey can say the same thing. I was definitely more affected by local politicians than and my family than I would say President Obama or President Trump. And actually, I even say this about politicians, that I don't really admire any politician. I think I can admire something that they do or respect or appreciate some of their leadership and some of their skills. But I'm under the impression that I don't want to admire a politician 100% of the time because then there's no independent thought, there's no free thinking, there's no debate even amongst our own party. But I think so for someone like myself to look at a politician that shaped my views, U.S. Senator, a former U.S. Senator and former Ambassador Scott Brown, former State Minority Leader Richard Tassay, who really paved the way for someone like myself to be duly elected to the Mass GOP State Committee, and somebody who, Richard Grinnell, which actually February 20th today in 2020, he was appointed the first openly gay presidential cabinet member in U.S. history.
Nico, I probably can imagine you might not really remember the Obama years.
I do.
You do?
Yeah,
You do? Okay, how old were you around then?
I was born in 2005, so I was 3 when he was first elected.
Okay,
I don't
you
remember that.
after that, yeah.
And then, but I mean, I'd say definitely post 2012. I remember, truth be told, my first political thought was liking Barack Obama because he killed Osama bin Laden. Honest to God, that was my thing. But I think that there was a post-World War II consensus that Donald Trump definitely broke around cordiality, around the manner of speaking, around genuinely the views that were held. I think some of that is good, others not so much. And I would argue that the chaotic nature I will be the first to say that Donald Trump probably didn't have any idea what he was doing when on January 20th, 2017. I think that was definitely a level of chaos that the American people were both uncomfortable with, and I felt that and I saw that. Even as a young person,
wow.
I was comfortable with it, being from the background that I was, but I can wholeheartedly understand, and I think it's a massive criticism of his about how that went. I don't think that he really could have prepared for it, considering, I don't think many people really expected him to win. I think Americans got really tired of the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan system, where Tip O'Neill would have dinner with Ronald Reagan and call him, in his words, I think, the single worst president of the United States that there's ever been. And then after the cameras are off, we'll say, hey, Ronnie, what's going on? You want to go grab some dinner? That really happened, and I think Americans got tired of that, and that the post-Trump world that we live in, the first statement is carried into the dinner. That's a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing that we're being honest with one another, but I think it's a bad thing that we're not able to separate the personal and the politics.
Mm-hmm. Going off of this topic of,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm a little lost. So, would you prefer for politics to be more divisive? Would you prefer for him to say he's the worst president in the entire world, and then also flip him off and walk out of the room? Is that what we're saying that we want to move towards?
No, and I think that level of childness should be called out, and it does exist in my party. It does exist in yours.
Yeah, but your party has a president right now who exists pretty well.
I don't disagree, and I think that if people were to do that, I think that would. I don't know if Donald Trump were to do that, it would really affect him that well, because Donald Trump is a political enigma when it comes to what normal PR rules do not apply to Donald Trump for the most part, I would argue.
I agree, but I think that's the problem. Like, why don't normal PR rules apply to him? Why can he get away with saying the things that he says?
That is a question that has. The answer to that will be revealed to us later, but in my opinion, has taken 75 years of a post-war political consensus around just how we interact with one another, that has resulted in several things that the American population are grossly sick and tired of. And there are probably situations that I agree with you. I'm not going to start naming any, but I think that there's a level of authenticity that those personal and problematic interactions. I see problematic in the terms of like coming to fisticuffs problematic. I think that level is something that people thought was missing, and and I'm not saying.
But politics is not reality TV. Like, I don't need to see my politicians fight with each other. I don't need them to be to bring this like almost discivilization to what is supposed to be an extremely civilized process. And the qualities that Donald Trump has as a leader are not qualities that I would want in a leader and someone that I have to follow. It's not qualities that I would employ in my organization.
I can't say that I entirely disagree with you. I think that there is. You said you don't want your politics to be a reality TV, but I think for many people that are interacting with politics, not to the extent that we do, or perhaps to the extent that we do and just want an inside look, I think Joe going to circle back to Joe Rogan, but I'm not talking about him in terms of masculinity. I think the idea of a person who's running for president of the United States sitting down for a 3-hour unedited interview, talking about, I mean, pretty much anything under the sun. I mean, I don't think, I could be wrong, in my opinion, I don't think I've ever seen that.
I think that avenue has existed in politics. I think we see the town hall where people come in and ask a totally unedited question.
Right, the podcast is new, but the town hall is old.
It's been around forever, and so I think...
We're repackaging old ideas.
Right, we really are in a lot of ways, and I think this is the way politics ought to be. I think that what we're doing here today, I'd be hard-pressed to find, 4 members of Congress who could sit down and do this. And I think that's a testament, though, to how divisive things are right now. And maybe it's a persona, or maybe it's not. I'm not quite sure. But in my opinion, I think people are really just that divisive right now, especially in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to see the temperature on the rhetoric cool down a little bit, and let's do this.
I mean, to your point, and BJ, to your point, I think Donald Trump is a product of our times, to be honest. I think there was a lot of hostility building up just amongst people on different political sides of the spectrum, and then Trump was that vacuum. He filled that vacuum. But now to your point, I think they're really, I'm speaking for myself, I really believe there is a desire for people of different political backgrounds and ideologies to work together, and I think that's what needs to happen.
So I want to get to a final question, and I'd like to hear from everybody on this. Who is a man in politics who you admire? And Alex, you actually kind of already answered this question, but who is a man in politics you admire and why? And BJ, and then we'll go around.
Do they have to be alive?
No.
Fred Hampton, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. He was, when I look at leadership, that's someone who I believe who stood for what they believed in, and they did it in a way that was about unity, funny enough, where he's bringing together black people from the city of Chicago and also poor white people from the suburbs of Chicago to come together to really reclaim their agency in this country that they live in. It became a point where it wasn't about race anymore. Like, it was about a class struggle. It was about the ideology of getting what you deserve as an American citizen or as a person that lives in this country in general. Like, if we live in a country that produces enough for everybody to have something, then everybody should have something. And I think that notion, that type of leadership, is extremely powerful. And I think that's why, what happened to him happened when he was 22 years old. But the reality is that's someone that I look to as a really good political leader.
Wonderful.
Yeah. No, Fred Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of what, organizing can be. I think it might be the pinnacle of what, organizing can be in the United States. Just thinking back, I mean, as you guys have talked earlier, but I'm a communications background. That's what I do. And I've always been one for, I love rhetoric. So when I think of politicians and I think of people who have kind of mastered the art of rhetoric, but not just, like I said earlier, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, I think of Bobby Kennedy, not the one now, but his father. He's just somebody that I think was motivated on the premise that they just wanted to make people's lives better. And I don't think we have a lot of politicians who are that way anymore. Obviously it was a family business for him, and so he kind of felt obligated to run for office, but I think he was doing it out of the goodness of his heart, and we just don't see that anymore. And so in a lot of ways, that's why I admire him and who he was. Somebody who stood up for what he believed in, somebody who never really wavered from their commitments, somebody who was open to having difficult conversations. And that, to me, is what we're missing right now. So I often will go back and read many of his books and listen to many of his speeches, and just to try to feel that energy and that passion that I think is from a bygone era, but that we can bring back today.
Great. All right.
I try not to break my rule, but there really is one politician that I truly, truly admire, and he is a friend of mine. It is former state representative, former Plymouth County District Attorney, and former U.S. Attorney Michael Sullivan from Abington. Someone who has spent his career fighting for the average man and woman, and really he wears his heart on his sleeve. And the local politics, I mean, it's like him reaching out, different things when I was on the select board, saying, hey, keep up the good work on this, or asking questions about that, having that local connection. And he never forgot where he came from, and that is something that I truly, truly admire, and such a good and strong leader. I mean, and the safety aspect that he brought for Plymouth County and to the U.S. Attorney's Office was absolutely, truly remarkable. And honestly, one of the most genuine, kind-hearted human beings.
Another guy I would say is George Galloway. In England, he's arguably left of Bernie Sanders, and you might say is somebody who's a Republican. Saying that is somewhat absurd, but I think that there is an aspect to politics especially in this country, that people get the sense that their politicians think that they're a better person than they are. And George Galloway, I don't agree with him on everything, including his Israel stance. I'm only saying that. But I think that he is one of those politicians that genuinely does not believe that he is better than the people that he represents. And I think that that is the single most paramount attribute that I could look for in someone to represent me.
Great. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
How do you define masculinity in the Trump era? Tell us in the comments, like, and subscribe.